Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. Around 6 million years ago, what is now called the known world entered a golden age of ecological prosperity. The planet as a whole was warm and humid. Thanks to a harvest from South America at the same time, coinciding with the same general climate and temperature, many animals such as caiman, sloth, and forest raccoon were particularly successful at the time alongside the native dinosaurs. By this time, the robust megaraptorans had established themselves as apex predators. The titanosaurs of the modern clade were abundant. This context of prosperity was prelude to the anchored period, an era of stability, which meant the elder god Rahar did not harvest from our world. There was simply no need. Prosperity was so great that the portal could finally rest. And rest it did. For almost 5 million years. Unfortunately, this golden age was not to last. 1.5 million years ago, the planet underwent swift and dramatic climate change, the likes of which Kaimere has not seen since the dynastic extinction. The exact cause of this change is debated, though the catalyst is generally attributed to the axial tilt of the planet shifting. The degree of change isn't known with much precision, but may have been a change of as many as 5 to 7 degrees. Earth has an axial tilt which generally cycles in a fluctuation between 22 and 24 degrees. This tilt as the planet spins around the sun is what creates seasons. When the southern axis points towards the sun, this hemisphere is in its summer. On the other side of the sun, as the southern axis points away from the sun, the hemisphere is in its winter. It seems our current level of tilt has been present for a while, though at various points in Earth's history, such as in the Cretaceous 84 million years ago, the tilt may have been only 12 degrees. Kaimere's axial tilt is around the same as Earth today, generally cycling at 21 degrees plus or minus 1 or 2. When the degree is higher, seasons are more pronounced. When the planet's spin is more level, seasonality is lower. Modern Kaimere has slightly less pronounced seasons than on Earth today. However, 1.5 million years ago, it seems the general fluctuation between 20 and 22 degrees went much more level than usual, and very quickly. Because of this, the cold latitudes got colder and the hot latitudes got hotter. This impacted currents of both wind and sea, as well as the seasons on which animals relied for migration and mating. The tropics became increasingly hot and arid. Since the cold regions got colder, polar ice spiked, and sea levels were reduced accordingly. Even the summers in the Great Caline Sea, Picardia, and southern Arvel were suddenly not warm enough to sustain many native plants used to brief and mild winters. The anchored period didn't end in hellfire from the sky or lava underfoot, but this drastic alteration in what had been the bountiful status quo took the legs out from all native animals specialized to this context. The most abundant and successful specialists were hit hardest. Titanosaurs, for example, had generally low tolerance for cold, so as southern Arvel became suddenly too cold for the existing species, it went extinct. The abundant megatherier sloths faced a similar predicament. The southern species of robust megaraptoran, which relied upon these giants for food, was quick to follow. The northern known world, increasing in temperature and became quite arid, had extinctions of its own, especially in the floodplains and wetlands. The Pekar of the modern Soritic wetlands was once part of a highly diverse genus, and is the last of its kind left standing. Caiman and ceratopsians suffered similarly, given their reliance on wetland vegetation to make nests. The Kotojaku also had several related species, and is likewise last of its genus in the known world. Several species of proboscidean, titanosaur, large thescelosaur, and sloth perished as the bulk food they relied upon disappeared. Low sea levels facilitated broader spread among the residents of the known world. In fact, a land bridge formed in northern Arvel connecting it to Nikar, allowing a biotic interchange, which further destabilized the region. Now, on Earth, all this would have been very challenging, but especially since the axial tilt resumed its conventional spin around 50,000 years later, it's likely that most of the existing faunal guild would have recovered. There would have been regional and even total species extinctions, but for the most part, the overall cast would have remained the same. That's what happened at the same time in Kairul. However, the territory of the portal is not treated to such a natural recovery. Once the god awakened to see its territory struggling at perhaps as little as 30% of its former biomass given the extinction of many large mammals and dinosaurs, the portal was quick to introduce new flora and fauna to the known world. As one might expect, the massive influx of harvested fauna was anything but helpful to the struggling ecosystems. Many new plants thrived in these unstable conditions, especially in the southern half of the known world. This region was still warmer than Pleistocene of Earth at the time, but it was colder than native flora preferred, and especially along southern Arvel, the floral turnover was staggering, with new plants making up as much as 90% of the floral base of the region. Kadan, or the Free States, and eastern Picardia also saw massive success in new plants, and while not on the same level of success as southern Arvel, there was still a substantial change, and this alteration of the floral base naturally favored the harvested animals already adapted for their consumption. Some new animals, like the Asian elephant and cynomastodon, went extinct shortly after their introduction. Others, like a species of stegodon, made up as much as half of the mammals, over a ton in some formations at the time, had enormous initial success, yet collapsed shortly thereafter, leaving no living descendants, yet having such abundance that they can reliably date the age of harvest. Some animals, however, integrated with local ecology, sometimes pushing native fauna to extinction. That's what happened with deer and bovid antelope. The forest meadows and open prairie ungulates of the anchored period were predominantly pronghorns and protoceratids. While both have their living descendants, they are overwhelmingly suffered from the turnover as the resident grazing and browsing herbivores of the antelope and deer introduced at this time. It is unknown what advantages the new fauna had. Some argue they may have been more efficient at digesting grass that was introduced alongside them, or it could be as simple as the pronghorns and protoceratids were vulnerable, and the deer and antelope came at a perfect time to take over before the native animals had a chance to recover. Protoceratids are known from only a few species on the fringes of the known world, and before housey grass spreading from Kairul brought clades from the Nikari prairies, pronghorn could only be found in Picardia. This was also the introduction of bovines to Kaimere. Even modern times, the cattle subfamily is not as successful as they are on Earth. This clade is very specialized in grass, which is not nearly as abundant in Kaimere. However, in regions like the Nikari Prairie and southern Arvel's grasslands, gar, water buffalo, and others absolutely thrived. The introduction of housey grass resulted in the extinction of several Nikari bovines down the road, but in the immediate aftermath of this harvest, as many as 5 species of bovine could be found in the pre-housey prairie. Of these, only the gar of the Western Crescent and water buffalo of the Seritic wetlands survived to modern times. Caprine bovids had much more success than their big-bodied cousins. Mountains are not without resident competition, but grasses and sedges tend to be comparable to earth, as opposed to horsetail and fern, which still compete more successfully in the lowlands of Kaimere. Because of this, bovids had much more options. Budorcus is a genus today represented by a single species, the taken, but has several species in Kaimere descended from this harvest. They are the largest of their clade in Kaimere, and are in many highland regions the most common megafauna, being quite sure-footed, despite the largest species weighing up to a ton. Though most proboscidean harvested at this time didn't have a lasting impression, a glowing exception to this was Mammuthus trogontherii, the steppe mammoth. To them, southern Arvel was a pristine habitat with no predators, minimal competition, and more grass than they could possibly know what to do with. Deer, rhinos, and bison were other megafauna introduced to this habitat, but again, none nearly on the level of a steppe mammoth in terms of size. The only remaining dinosaurs in the area were small elasmarians. Hesperotherium was the last calicothere of Earth, and when it was introduced to Arvel in the Pleistocene, it was now also the last calicothere of the known world, reviving a dynasty which had gone extinct since before the Anchored period. In modern times, the Glanos has come to Hyrule, so it is no longer alone. Gigantopithecus was struggling on Earth due to the steady cooling of its climate and reduction in their forest habitat, but in the bamboo forest of the highlands of northern Arvel and Kajar, this enormous ape absolutely thrived. A panda of the same genus as modern pandas was also initially extremely successful in this niche and biome. Waterfowl were particularly hard hit by the preluding extinction ending the Anchored period. Because of this, a vast majority of wetland birds in the known world originate from this harvest. Freshwater fish in many regions also experienced a shift favoring newly harvested species. Salmonids were known from earlier harvests, though this era appears to have been particularly successful for them. Trout became very common in many freshwater habitats, and Pacific salmon not only came with several species, they then underwent an adaptive radiation to many new river systems for spawning. They had become a staple in temperate rivers and the Great Kaleen Sea. The large mammal predator guild also saw a massive turnover. Throughout the Anchored period, Machairodonts, or saber-toothed cats, were the most abundant and successful of the big cat niche, having largely replaced the Nimrovids in the Arid period prior to the Anchored period. There were a few robust Machairodontine cats, with both Amphimachairodus and Nimravides being harvested 8 million years ago. The more cursorial descendants of Amphimachairodus were more successful on Earth, though during the Anchored period, it was the more robust descendants of Nimravides which dominated, because favoring closed forests meant that it had fewer theropod predators and competitors. These two genera vied for the title of top cat, yet the most successful clade were the Metailurines, ranging from small arboreal predators, wetland prowlers, and robust macropredators of their own. There were some smaller Nimrovids, and Epicyon was a borophagine dog, which both seem to have vied for the niche, though Epicyon appears to have been fairly restricted to highlands in an effort to avoid theropods, while surviving Nimrovids were fairly small. Most of these big mammal predators went extinct at this time. A rush of new large cats were introduced, and largely replaced the native cats. This is not to say anything of the superiority of the newcomers, just that they had the good fortune of being brought with appreciable numbers while native taxa were struggling. Regardless of why, the replacement was quite thorough, at least in the well-sampled fossil sites of the known world. It can be quite difficult to diagnose fossil animals in Kaimere to match those of Earth. We might find a skeleton of the same species on both planets at the same time, But if both skeletons are only 20% complete with no overlapping diagnostic elements, we may never know. For this reason, it can often be quite difficult to say with much confidence that a known fossil animal is our fossil record was even harvested, much less definitely ancestral to modern Chimeran species. For this reason, it is rare for the assembly to reliably link species past the Miocene. However, it does get easier with time. By this harvest, the fossil record of both Earth and Kaimere are sampled enough that many confident links can be drawn, at least on the genus level. Several specimens from Dinofelis, Meganterion, Homotherium, Puma, and Panthera are 5 genera which were brought to Kaimere and had rapid success, kicking the old guard while they were down and taking their place. It was from this stock that a new regime arose. Puma, having an analogous lifestyle to leopards, were perhaps the greatest success story of the large cats from this harvest, especially in Arvel. In these early years, with low sea levels, they spread very far, suggesting a comfort in swimming. They ranged throughout the known world and beyond on both continents, as well as many islands, having rapid success. Panthera was generally restricted to the dense forests, though it's possible Panthera tooth was found in the highland deposits, perhaps corresponding with a snow leopard. The modern Nogash, or Nikari tiger, is perhaps descended from this harvest, though some have argued they instead are descendants of the Panthera species Gombazoigensis in the next harvest. If that's the case, then none of these Panthera species are confirmed to survive to modern times, but they were very common initially, most abundant in the close forests of Nikar, while the puma was more successful in the southern half of the known world. Homotherium was, and to this day remains, successful throughout Kaimere, as the recovering world still belonged to the titanosaurs and kept the forests opened. Open forests favor the cursorial adaptations of Homotherium, while they still have claws retractable and sharp enough to climb. They also thrived in the open prairies of Nikar, which at the time was a much more diverse floral ecology with the species-poor housey prairie of today. Meganterion was also quite successful in the Titan Gardens. These heavily built cats were quite proficient at swiftly taking down and dispatching large game, and being extremely powerful climbers, could then bring even large kills out of reach of other threats. They seem to have had a Nikari species, though it was their Arvelith and Kodjarith populations which were most abundant. There's some debate about the modern red panther. Many assembly naturalists consider it a species of Dinofelis which came from this harvest. Dinofelis is one of the last metallurines on Earth, the same clade which were most speciose in the anchored period of Kaimere. Red panthers certainly spread far and fast shortly after the conclusion of the anchored period, becoming a common predator in dense forests and wetlands of both continents and Picardia. If they are indeed a species of Dinofelis, it was one that underwent a similar boom of success across the known world, spreading through land bridges and narrow seas, same as the puma. However, another theory suggests that the red panther is instead descended from an older lineage of American metallurines present just before the anchored period. If so, it would be the last of the old guard, booming in population just as its former competitors went extinct. There's no particularly good specimens from either species to compare or close relatives to contrast genetic markers, just a bunch of fragmentary remains, and they're obviously wide range today. This was not only a lot of new arrivals from Earth, harvested and scattered throughout the known world, but also a time of migration of native fauna which took up the known world and shaped much of what we know today. For example, Picardia was much more impacted by the migration of mainland fauna than of harvested animals. Low sea levels facilitated the migration of titanosaurs, sloths, mastodon, noasaurs, and megaraptorans, which largely replaced native megafauna, and water buffalo, jackals, and hippos from this harvest only made things worse. Indeed, many of these harvested animals have actually been replaced in Qajar, or the Free States, and then crossed to Picardia, which appears to have been quite easily accessible by island hopping. Though Picardia has a reputation as being a wild and insular land, the reality is that less than 10% of lowland megafauna are native, and the highlands are much better. Most of this new cast came from Earth or Arvel during this time period 1.5 million years ago. Some have argued that the reason this harvest spanned such a long time and ranged wider than most harvests taking flora and fauna from Earth is because it was technically 2 harvests back to back. Most animals harvested from Sahul, for example, are dated a bit later. You can learn more about these animals and the plethora of descended species in this episode here. The planet had realigned before the end of the harvest estimates, so if climate was a factor, it may have been that things were simply returning to the way they were during the anchored period, though the axial tilt would have had consequences once more down the road. A return to a more seasonal world saw a shift back to many clades that survived, such as caiman reclaiming lost territory to the more arid-adapted crocodiles, but in many cases, the new world order had been established, and the old clades would never again reclaim what was lost. This second, drastic change to the climate may have caused the extinction of animals that initially thrived, such as stegodon. However, a peculiar animal, taken early in this harvest, is also suggested to have been a culprit for adding to the high rates of extinction and prolonging the harvest. Homo erectus. While chimeras are the dominant human species in the known world today, they are far from its earliest human settlers. Over 1 million years before the first ancestors of chimerans were taken from Africa, Homo erectus was introduced to this new world from Asia. They may not have had complex language, bows and arrows, or even fire, but they still found a far-reaching success in both Nikar and Arvel. It is possible that these unprecedented predators caused even further extinctions, and the harvest was prolonged because of it. Stegodon, for example, has been found with marks of being butchered by Acheulean tools. It appears Homo erectus took a liking to Stegodon at the time, perhaps even hunting them to extinction. In Earth's history, Homo erectus practiced an avoidance of carnivore-rich areas in their origin in Africa, and appear to have been less concerned with this as they spread to Europe and Asia. It has been suggested that this was due to improvements in Acheulean technology that went on, but it may simply be that Eurasia didn't have as many or as dangerous large predators as Africa 1.5 million years ago. The reverse was true of Homo erectus brought to Kaimere at this time. While they needed fresh water, ample game, and outcrops yielding ample flint for the craft of their tools, the former 2 requirements meant that they were in many cases forced to compete with space with predators now more than an order of magnitude larger than the most formidable predators back home. Needing flint for their tools drew them toward riverbeds in the highlands, and this meant that they could avoid the worst of the predators. Then again, the predators used to hunting humans, like the hyena Pachycrocuta and a new cast of big cats, suddenly weren't apex predators anymore. To the terror birds, large cockatrices, and young megaraptorans, already used to hunting other big cats and analogous predators, they were just another source of prey. It's possible that, at least for a time, being unfamiliar prey to the monarchs and vassals, and their own familiar predators suddenly forced into hiding, may well have benefited these first human pioneers. Although some evidence suggests they spread all over Kaimere quite quickly, it seems based on surveys conducted by the Great Library, they were most common and successful in the highlands of Arvel at this time. The Homo erectus in the dense lowland forests had a lot of initial success, hunting stegodon in forests too dense for titans and megaraptorans, but it seems once their main food source went extinct, they suddenly became much less common. While the impact of Homo erectus on megafaunal extinctions and harvests at this time remains debated, what is known with much greater certainty is them being one of the major factors in the following harvest, though that's a story for another time. Cheers to Ian for sponsoring this episode. As it is among the most influential harvests of modern Kaimerian species from many clades, it is one I definitely wanted to cover, and I'm very thankful for Ian for making that possible. Thanks again to Ian, to my Patreon patrons for their support, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks!